Warning, this video is badly done and poorly executed, and I feel bad for the shame it has cost me and my family for its creation. As for the rest of you, piss off. Hello, Thaddeus. Today we're going to talk about riots and why Americans are bad at it. Brazil is currently having a bunch of protests, Turkey is having a bunch of protests, all the other countries that were having protests are still having protests unless they've overthrown their governments, in which case they're still having protests because the new governments aren't quite what they need to be. Here's the riots that started happening in 2010. Now we add in 2011, here's 2012, and here's the riots with 2013. And if you go since 2000, this is what the map looks like. Now if you go since 1990, this is what the map looks like. And if you go since Reagan and Thatcher, so you can see there's been quite a few revolutions. So these protests tend to take a sort of unified path. First you start off with having some sort of inciting incident. So in the case of Brazil, it was the fare hikes on public transportation. Or in my Lego example, cops beating the crap out of some working class people for no good reason. And then this escalates to a sort of massive protest, and then the police come in, and like any good peaceful protest where the cops are called in, it suddenly turns violent. And then it escalates. Now there's a lot of rhetoric, particularly coming out of kind of our American news channels and other sorts of official media outlets. They tend to take a very negative view of these protesters and what they're fighting for, especially when they're trying to upset a close U.S. ally or a strategic U.S. position in the regions. One of the reasons other than geopolitical military strength that has our elected officials kind of up in arms about these protests is that these protests are out of their control and tend to have a tint of anti-US, anti-Western values to them. One of the big reasons for this is that they are protesting what is considered neoliberalism and neoliberal economic policies. This is where you get a lot of the austerity measures coming from and a lot of the economic inequality. Now, Alain Baudu wrote a really kind of interesting article, or maybe it was a lecture, I'm not exactly sure what it came from, but he was talking about why Turkey is having the revolution or the protest the way it is, not so much a revolution at this point, but hopefully it'll get there, is that they are kind of restarting history in a way, which is a jab at Francis Fukuyama's End of History article, where he basically suggested that the rise of neoliberalism was the end of all history. It was the best thing that was ever going to happen. And so by kind of coming out and protesting against that neoliberalism, they're restarting history, or they're beginning history anew. Now, the really interesting part of this article in terms of how it applies to America and why our Occupy movements failed is that Turkey, the Brazils, a lot of these Arab Spring countries, they have an educated populace, but what they've never had is a period of Roosevelt capitalism that we had in the United States that essentially built a middle class. So these countries are essentially in kind of a period of the labor movement in the United States. We're talking kind of late 1800s, early 1900s, when we had a lot of labor movement activity in the United States. It got pretty violent. That's sort of where a lot of these other countries are at. They've started developing, but because they're developing at a period where they're kind of at a disadvantage because there's global superpowers. So one of the big differences is that because we have a established middle class in the United States, we have a sort of wealth basis to kind of shelter ourselves from the greater effects of the recession and of these neoliberal policies that are putting money back into the hands of the elites. At least you think neoliberalism is a Democrat idea or a Republican idea. It's really both. They've been practicing it since the time of Reagan, Thatcher. Here are some proponents of neoliberalism that you might know. There's Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, George Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and this guy is President Obama. I know he's not black, but you can tell it's President Obama because he's got a bunch of drones behind him. And then you have a bunch of corporate types and their hangers-on, and the relationship between our government officials and our rich 1% looks something like this. Thaddeus, I will see you in the future.
They will see you in the future. They are traveling.